Hello, I'm Donald Duke, and welcome to another edition of Bridging the Gap. The problem with power supply in Nigeria is really that of dealing with an unplanned society where we don't forecast our growth and the requirements to mitigate or blend with the growth. For instance, we have unplanned cities that just spring up, then we now start trying to put infrastructure after the city. And the entire concept of power generation is wrong. We're still running the country as a small country. We had the Electricity Corporation of Nigeria prior to independence in the late 50s, and our population was barely 45 million. A lot of it was in the rural areas. And so ECN, as it was then called, was largely dealing with a few urban cities, Lagos, maybe Kaduna, Enugu, Port Harcourt, and Kano. Today, our population has grown from 45 to almost 200 million. More than half of it is in the urban areas. The generation and supply of power has not in any way accorded with the growth of the population and the industrial requirements attendant to this growth. The first error is this: power supply is local. It has to be local, like water supply. So you've got to localize the generation or the transmission and the distribution of power within an area. It's foolhardy taking power from one end of the country, from, say, the Niger Delta, for instance, and trying to transmit it to as far as Sokoto, because along the way, the energy supply will reduce. So if you start with 1,000 megawatts in Port Harcourt, generating from Port Harcourt, by the time it gets to Sokoto, it will probably not be more than 300-400, because along the line you lose the power. So you've got to localize it, and that's the same thing with water. You don't have one agency producing water for the entire nation. It's all localized within towns and cities. Power shouldn't be any different. In fact, anything that is very essential to human living ought to be localized. So we ought to find power sources either through coal, and you must have an admixture of various sources of power. You could use coal, you could use gas, you could use HPFO, that's high power fuel oil, or LPFO, low power fuel oil, if your refineries are working. But you ought to have an admixture of various sorts. Now there's solar that has been added onto the mix, there's wind that has been added onto the mix. In advanced countries, they have nuclear power all in the mix, because different sources ensures that there's a regularity of supply regardless of what happens. So we immigrated from ECN to NEPA and PHCN. Just nomenclatures were changing. They were probably still doing the same thing. They were still generating the power, transmitting and distributing, all under one organization. It's absolutely impossible to do this. This is a large country. The government has made certain attempts to change the structure of power. They have privatized the distribution, what they like to call the DISCOs, the distribution corporations all over the country, and there's several of them. They've privatized generation, but transmission is a bit tricky because it goes across state lines and all that. Unfortunately, it wasn't properly thought through. The distribution companies have problems in A, collecting revenues from users, B, getting enough power into the system so that they can generate enough revenues to cover their costs. Again, the government is still regulating power. And so the cost of generation and the cost of distribution is not met by the approved pricing that government allows. And so there's a shortfall, and we need to get into that conversation. But there are other ways. We're a nation that flares 2.5 billion cubic feet of gas. A short way around this is actually distribute this gas and have industrial zones in every nook and cranny of the country, in every senatorial district. There are 109 senatorial districts in Nigeria. We can have industrial parks, and the power from gas, which we currently flare, distributed to all these parks. That frees power from industrial application to home use and other semi-commercial usage. And that, for me, is a short cut. It will take, my estimation, another 5 to 10 years, the way the government is going, and as aggressively as they may want to, and I'm not sure they have the resources to back themselves up in this regard, it may take them as long as 10 years to fulfill the power requirements of Nigeria, because a nation of our size, yes, with low industrial output and all that, would require anywhere between 50 to 100,000 megawatts of power. If you consider the amount of generators in the country and their output, if you aggregate all of them together, of course, they generate more power than the public power system. And therefore, there is, if you put all of that together, I think Nigeria will require anywhere between 80 to 100,000 megawatts of power to be power sufficient and also to boost industrial output. So, and that's not going to happen overnight. And it's very, very expensive. So the other way around it is to take the gas that we currently flare or we don't use appropriately and distribute it. So that if I have an industry, for instance, or a huge factory, all I need to do is get a power plant, a turbine or whatever, and connect it. And I have free fuel because the gas is fuel. Okay? Yes, there's a capital cost of buying my generator and all that, but that's a capital cost. I can amortize it over a period. But the real cost for running power on a generating system is a fuel cost, because that is a recurrent cost. Now, the second thing is make that as affordable as possible. If you ask me, I'll probably make it free of charge, but make it as affordable as you can to ensure that almost like a subsidy to our industry, because industrial output and cost of production in Nigeria is really, really high. You need to find some other ways to cushion that cost. And fuel, which we're currently flaring, could just be that cushion that industry needs. We need to take industrial production in Nigeria, which is about 4 or 5%, to at least 25%. Our GDP 25% of our GDP should come from industrial or manufacturing, and not 4 or 5%, which is abysmally low. And all this using gas and also for industry, and working alongside with existing and strengthening the discos and the gencos, and not over-regulating them as we currently do. I believe in 5 years we can resolve this problem once and for all. And the effects of the policy will be very visible after 24 months. If discos were allowed to charge appropriately, these are private companies and they're profit bearing. We don't want them to overcharge. That I can understand that. But it's easy to determine how much it would cost. This is the cost for the power, and this is a cost for providing the infrastructure for distribution, and a certain margin could be allowed. This is something that they can sit down and work out with the government and come up with a cost. Because right now, most of them are not able to service the banks. The banks are under enormous strain, having funded the distribution companies, and there's no resort. So it's, I believe that rather than subsidize fuel, right, it's easier and more applicable and more wide-reaching to make power the subsidy for everyone if we needed to subsidize anything. But really, it's not a subsidy because it increases your output. And as long as the output is increased both at the manufacturing level and the home input, we all live better lives and all that, the tax bracket also would go up. So that would take care of the cost that we think we currently subsidize. But subsidizing fuel doesn't work. It only works for you're subsidizing the elites. They're the ones that have the cars. They're the ones that consume and all. They don't need the subsidies. The subsidies really are for the home users and all that. But for industry, yes, because this is a difficult environment to work through. And the next target should be every home should have power. Every home should have power. It shouldn't be a privilege any longer. In modern living, it's a necessity. Whether you're in the rural or in the urban areas, you should have access to power. If you don't, then you start having felling of trees for firewood, for this and that. And so it affects the environment ultimately. And we need to embrace technology in this regard. You know that today you have roofing tiles that are solar panels. Okay? These are the sort of things we should embrace. And in our rural or mass housing schemes, particularly in the rural areas, they're not on the national grid because each roofing panel is a solar grid. And we need all these ideas, an admixture of everything we can bring to the table to make sure that Nigeria is no longer an energy deficient country, which is our strength. We're phenomenally wealthy in petroleum products, gas and crude oil, coal. We have one of the largest coal belts anywhere in the world, stretching across from Kogi right through to Enugu in the east. We have the second largest deposits of bitumen after Canada. So if you look at the energy mixture, and if you talk of solar, the entire northern belt by the Sahel is a solar belt. So all that, there is absolutely no reason why Nigeria should not only be self-sufficient in power, but it should be one of our major exports to our neighbors. Until next time, let's keep hope alive. Thank you.